Picture a place where the ground itself is broken. Not cracked like a sidewalk, but split into hard, dry plates, like a dinner plate someone dropped on a kitchen floor. The dirt is baked so hard that when rain finally falls, it does not even soak in. It just runs off like water sliding off a rock. There are no trees standing anywhere. The river that used to run through this valley is nothing but a pale, dry scar cutting through dead land. If you stood there and looked around, you would not see a single living thing moving. Now picture this. Someone drives a truck up to that dead, cracked wasteland. They open a metal cage in the back, and they let out one single animal into all that emptiness. A chubby rodent covered in thick brown fur with giant orange teeth, blinking in the sunlight at a place that has no water for it to swim in and not one tree for it to chew down. The people standing there watching this happen honestly thought it was a joke. They thought this animal was doomed. How is a creature famous for building dams supposed to build anything without water? How is an animal that survives by cutting down trees supposed to live somewhere with no trees at all? It looked less like the start of a comeback story, and more like watching someone leave a poor animal out in a desert to die alone. And then that one small animal did something that decades of trained engineers, millions and millions of dollars, and mountains of poured concrete had completely and totally failed to do. It brought an entire dead valley back to life. My name is Edmund Hale, and today I am going to tell you one of the strangest, most jaw-dropping comeback stories in the history of modern conservation. Stick with me all the way to the end, because where this story ends up is honestly hard to believe, even when you are looking straight at the proof. And before we get into it, if stories like this one blow your mind the way they blow mine, hit that like button and subscribe, because it genuinely takes a huge amount of digging and research to bring you true stories this wild, and it helps more than you know. Okay, let's set the scene properly. We are heading to north-central Washington state, to a place called the Methow Valley and the wild, rugged country around it, back in the early 2000s. This was land that was in deep trouble. A warming climate, years and years of drought, and a full century of humans messing with the natural landscape had drained these rivers and streams almost completely dry. See, mountains usually build up a thick blanket of snow in the winter. That snow melts slowly all through the summer, feeding the streams down below little by little. But that snowpack was getting thinner and thinner every single year. Rivers that used to flow strong and full were sitting nearly empty by the time August rolled around. And when wildfire season came, and it always came, the fires hit incredibly hard. Flames tore through forests that were as dry as kindling, leaving behind blackened, lifeless hillsides that stretched for miles. And that is when the real damage actually began. See, burned ground cannot soak up rainwater. The fire bakes the soil until it practically turns to glass on top. So when storms finally rolled through, the water did not sink into the earth where it was needed. Instead, it rushed straight down the slopes in filthy, muddy floods, dragging ash and burnt branches and loose dirt down into whatever was left of the streams below. It became a brutal, repeating cycle. Drought first, then fire, then flooding, then erosion washing away whatever soil remained, then nothing, just bare, dead land. And over, that same terrible cycle kept spinning year after year, getting worse each time. The strange part is that people were not sitting back doing nothing. Government agencies all across the western United States tried very hard to fix this problem using engineering. They poured concrete to build storage reservoirs. They used bulldozers to carve out artificial ponds. They laid down miles and miles of underground pipe to move water around. Every single one of these projects cost enormous amounts of money, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions, just for one stretch of one stream. Work crews even tried building fake beaver dams out of wooden posts and woven branches, specifically designed to copy what real beavers naturally do in the wild. And almost every single time, a heavy rainstorm would roll through and simply rip those fake dams apart within a matter of months. The structures needed constant babysitting. Crews had to keep going back out to repair them, rebuild them, patch them up again and again. They never held for long, no matter how much time or money was poured into them. And that raises a pretty obvious question, does it not? If the entire goal of these projects was to copy exactly what a real beaver does in nature, then why was nobody just letting a real beaver do it instead? The honest answer is that people had simply forgotten that beavers were even an option anymore. And to understand exactly why that happened, we need to rewind the clock a few hundred years. Long before European fur trappers ever set foot in North America, this entire continent was, in a very real and literal sense, built by beavers. We are talking about tens of millions of them. Some scientists estimate the true number ran into the hundreds of millions. Beaver dams were absolutely everywhere you looked. Ponds sparkled with sunlight in nearly every mountain valley. Streams spread out into wide, tangled wetlands instead of running in one thin, straight line. Water soaked sideways into the land instead of rushing directly out to the ocean. That soggy, slow, complicated, richly alive landscape was simply the normal, natural state of these watersheds for thousands of years. Then the fur trade arrived, and it hit the beaver population like a sledgehammer. Beaver pelts became one of the single most valuable goods traded anywhere in the entire world. People wanted the fur to make hats and coats, and trappers worked their way across the whole continent, decade after decade after decade, catching every beaver they could find. By the early 1900s, the very same animal that had engineered half of an entire continent had been trapped down to almost nothing. Populations that once numbered in the hundreds of millions were reduced to small, scattered pockets here and there. And here is the part that most people never even think about. When those beavers disappeared, their dams did not just get left behind for someone else to take care of. They got completely abandoned. With no beavers left to patch holes or add fresh mud and branches, the old dams slowly broke apart, washed away piece by piece, and vanished for good. The ponds behind them drained out. The wide wetlands dried up into hard dirt. All that water which used to be held back gently for months on end suddenly had nothing left to slow it down, so it simply rushed straight off the land and disappeared downstream. The deep, spongy, water-holding landscape that used to stretch across the American West quietly collapsed, piece by piece, without almost anyone noticing it was even happening. Most people alive today never knew that lush, wet version of the land ever existed in the first place. We simply inherited the dried-out, cracked version, and everyone just assumed that was how the land was naturally supposed to look. So here is where our story really begins. In 2007, a small group of wildlife biologists working in Washington state decided to try something that honestly sounded a little bit crazy at the time. See, there were beavers living in towns and neighborhoods nearby that were causing real headaches for people. They were flooding golf courses, chewing down people's favorite ornamental trees, and clogging up drainage pipes called culverts. Normally, when a beaver caused that much trouble, the answer was simple and final. You trapped it and you killed it. But this small group of biologists decided to try something completely different instead. They started trapping these so-called troublemaker beavers alive, keeping them safe and unharmed, and then driving them far up into the high, empty, badly damaged valleys we talked about earlier. In other words, they were taking an animal that everyone treated as an annoying pest and giving it a brand new job. They were hiring it for free, as a professional restoration engineer. Now, to be fair to the doubters, the skeptics actually had a pretty solid point at the time. The release sites looked absolutely nothing like proper beaver habitat. There was no standing water anywhere. There were no trees for building material or food. There was nothing that looked remotely inviting for an animal like this. You could practically hear people whispering their doubts out loud. These poor animals are going to wander off looking for a better home, or they are simply going to die within the week. But that is not even remotely what happened. Within just a few short weeks, something almost touching started to happen. With no proper wood or branches anywhere nearby, the beavers used whatever scraps of material they could scrape together: dried clumps of grass, bits of sagebrush, balls of mud, even small stones and pebbles. And they began stacking all of it carefully across the bone-dry creek beds. Now, let's be completely honest here. Their first attempts were pretty rough-looking. We are talking about knee-high little heaps that looked more like a toddler's messy sandcastle at the beach than any kind of real serious dam. It would have been incredibly easy for anyone watching to write the whole experiment off as a failure right then and there. And then spring finally arrived, and snowmelt came rushing down off the mountains the way it always does every single year. And those silly, laughable little heaps of grass and mud did exactly the job they were built to do. Instead of all that melting snow rushing straight through the valley and disappearing within a couple of days, like it always used to, it slammed into those little dams and it stalled out completely. The water pooled up behind them. It backed up higher and higher. It pushed sideways out into ground that had not held a single drop of moisture in years and years. And down underneath the surface, in soil that had been nothing but dry dust for ages, water actually started moving again, flowing quietly through old underground channels that had been sitting empty and forgotten. Scientists had buried special sensors deep in the dirt to track exactly what was happening below the surface, and those sensor readings started climbing steadily. Soil moisture levels rose by a third or even more in just a matter of months. Old natural springs that local residents swore had been completely dead for decades suddenly started to trickle again, and then that trickle slowly grew into an actual flow of water, and then, almost like magic, the color green started to appear. Tiny shoots began popping up all around the edges of the new ponds. Willow branches pushed their way up through the newly wet earth, sinking their roots down deep and pulling the underground water table up even higher than before. And now, for the very first time, the beavers finally had real, proper building material to work with. You could actually watch them switch from scraping together dried grass to felling real, live saplings, dragging thick branches across the ground and raising their dams higher and wider into much sturdier, more permanent structures. Cottonwood trees and aspen trees followed right behind the willow, sprouting up all around the growing ponds. Birds arrived to build nests in the new branches. Dragonflies zipped and stitched their way back and forth across the open water. The soil itself grew darker and softer as life slowly worked its way back down into it, layer by layer. Within roughly 3 years, valleys that had once looked like nothing but cracked, lifeless wasteland were now running with beautiful green corridors packed full of trees and flowing water. And here is something the trees did that mattered far more than people first realized. They cast shade down over the streams, and that shade kept the water cool. Now, that might sound like a small, minor detail, but it genuinely is not. There is a specific temperature line, somewhere in the high 60s Fahrenheit, and once water crosses above that line, young salmon simply cannot survive in it anymore. Warm water is basically lethal water as far as baby salmon are concerned. By shading and cooling down these streams, the beavers had quietly, almost accidentally, pushed the water temperature back down below that dangerous line. And because of that, the salmon actually came back. Fish swam up out of the warmer rivers down in the lowlands and pushed their way into the cool, complicated maze of pools and channels that the beavers had carefully built. Young salmon found safe shelter tucked among all the submerged branches and sunken logs. More hiding spots meant more protection from predators. More cover meant more food sources and more room to grow up healthy and strong. When biologists went out and actually counted fish, the streams that had beaver dams in them held several times more young salmon compared to the bare, dam-free streams nearby. Think about that for a second. An animal that almost nobody on Earth associates with fish had become one of the single best things that ever happened to salmon populations in that entire region. Now, here comes the part of this story that genuinely surprised even the trained scientists studying it closely. Because the very next major test these valleys faced was not drought at all this time, it was wildfire. When a wildfire eventually swept back through this region again, and it absolutely did happen again, the flames tore across the dry, brittle countryside exactly the same terrifying way fires always had before. But then something strange happened. When those flames finally reached the wet beaver wetlands, they simply stalled out and stopped. Saturated, waterlogged ground does not burn. Thick, lush, green vegetation does not catch fire the same way crisp, dead, dried-out brush does. Standing open water is, quite literally by definition, fireproof. So the areas around the beaver ponds turned into little green islands sitting in the middle of the destruction. Fire scientists actually have a specific name for this. They call these surviving green patches refugia, meaning places of shelter and refuge. These were patches of living, breathing green, sitting completely untouched, right in the middle of a scorched, blackened landscape. And this was not just a nice story people like to tell each other around a campfire either. A scientist named Emily Fairfax studied this exact phenomenon in a careful, systematic way, comparing river corridors that had beavers living in them against river corridors that did not, across several different major wildfires out west. Her research found that stretches of river with active beaver dams burned roughly 3 times less than similar stretches without any beavers at all. 3 times less. If you look at these areas from an airplane or from satellite photos, the contrast is almost unbelievable to look at. You see a bright, vivid ribbon of living green winding its way through miles and miles of gray ash and blackened tree trunks. And right at the very heart of that green ribbon, you find a beaver pond sitting quietly. While a massive wildfire raged just next door, the beavers' own little neighborhood stayed green, cool, and completely alive. And every single creature that could manage to reach that safe zone in time had somewhere real to shelter until the danger passed. Now let's think about this from a purely money-focused angle for a moment, because honestly, this next part is almost funny when you really sit and think about it. Fighting a single major wildfire can easily cost tens of millions of dollars in equipment, aircraft, and personnel. Meanwhile, catching a couple of troublesome beavers and driving them up into a valley costs a couple of $1,000s at most. For decades, we have been spending absolutely enormous fortunes fighting the painful symptoms of a dried-out, damaged landscape, while the exact animal that naturally keeps landscapes wet and fire-resistant was sitting right there the entire time, being treated like a pest to be trapped and killed. And slowly, the people who used to complain the loudest about beavers started to notice the change happening around them. Ranchers and farmers who once cursed these animals for flooding their fields began to notice that their wells were not running dry as often anymore. Groundwater levels were actually recharging and coming back up. Water that beaver dams held back during the spring snowmelt slowly seeped back out through the dry summer months, keeping pastures green and healthy without the ranchers needing to spend money on expensive water pumps. One rancher even sat down and calculated exactly how much money this was saving him every single year, and it added up to thousands of dollars in savings. The animal everyone once considered a nuisance had quietly become the single most cost-effective employee working on the entire property, and it never even asked to be paid. By the early 2020s, this whole beaver relocation idea had stopped being a strange little experiment and had officially become a proven, respected model that other places wanted to copy. Hundreds of beavers had been relocated across dozens of different sites throughout these watersheds, and a strong percentage of them successfully settled down and built lasting territories of their own. And here is the really beautiful part. Every single successful beaver pair that settled into a new area set off its own chain reaction of new life. Moose started wading through the newly formed ponds. Elk came down to graze in the wet green meadows nearby. Mink and muskrat moved back in along the muddy banks. Migrating birds began dropping in by the hundreds to rest and refuel on long journeys. Stretches of land that used to barely support a dozen different species were suddenly bursting with 100 different species, or even more. All because one single animal was simply allowed to do its one natural job, and an entire thriving community of life rebuilt itself around that one small effort. And once you learn to recognize this pattern, you honestly start noticing it happening all over the world in surprising places. Up in northern Canada, after a pipeline accident sent oil leaking toward a nearby waterway, it was actually a beaver dam that caught the spill and held it back before it could ever reach the river downstream. Nobody planned for that. Nobody budgeted a single dollar for it. It was simply an accidental piece of pollution control provided completely free of charge by a beaver dam that happened to already be there. Down in the Chesapeake Bay region of the United States, scientists have measured beaver ponds filtering out a huge percentage of the nitrogen pollution that normally causes dangerous, toxic algae blooms in the water. That is exactly the kind of expensive cleanup work that would normally cost water treatment plants millions and millions of dollars to replicate using machines and chemicals. And over in a national park in Alberta, Canada, researchers using satellite images actually discovered a single beaver dam stretching roughly half a mile long from end to end. That is longer than the Hoover Dam, one of the largest human-built dams on the entire planet. It is a structure so massive that it clearly took many, many generations of beaver families working together over years and years to complete it. You can genuinely see this dam from outer space using satellite photos. But my personal favorite example out of this entire story, and honestly the most embarrassing one for us humans, comes from the Czech Republic. Government authorities there had spent years, all the way back since 2018, trying to build a dam to protect a river called the Klobava. This river is home to a population of critically endangered crayfish, and the plan was to protect them from acidic, sediment-filled water leaking out of nearby ponds. The project had an official government permit. It had detailed blueprints drawn up by trained engineers. And it was hopelessly, completely stuck, tangled up for years in land disputes and thick piles of government paperwork, going absolutely nowhere for the better part of an entire decade. Then, in early 2025, a family of just 8 beavers wandered into the area and simply built the dam themselves. They built it in exactly the right spot. They built it better than the original human blueprint had even called for. The wetland area they created ended up being roughly twice the size that the trained engineers had originally drawn up on paper. And these 8 beavers finished the entire project in a matter of weeks, using nothing but wood, stones, and mud that they gathered themselves. They did it for absolutely free. In doing so, they saved Czech taxpayers something in the neighborhood of $1 million. A conservation official who commented on the story basically said that the beavers had accomplished exactly what years and years of careful human planning had completely failed to do. And unlike the human contractors, the beavers never sent anybody an invoice for their work. And really, when you step back and look at the whole picture, that is what this entire story truly comes down to. For the better part of an entire century, we approached a badly damaged natural world using the exact same tool we always reach for first: more engineering. Bigger concrete reservoirs, longer stretches of underground pipe, more poured concrete, more money spent every single year, and a huge amount of it simply failed or washed away in the very first hard rainstorm, or ended up costing far more to maintain than anybody could realistically afford long term. This whole time, the real solution was walking around on four legs, carrying a set of giant orange teeth, backed by roughly 10 million years of evolution that had already perfected the exact job we kept paying human contractors to attempt and fail at over and over again. These animals do not simply live inside ecosystems the way most creatures do. They actively build ecosystems. They maintain them. They heal them when they are broken. Water that used to rush away uselessly now stays put and spreads out gently across the land. Ground that used to be cracked and dying is now wet, soft, and covered in growing plants. Fish that had completely vanished from these rivers are spawning again in healthy numbers. Forests that were burned down to blackened stumps now have a living green heart to slowly recover and regrow from. And none of this required some brilliant scientific breakthrough or a massive government budget to accomplish. What it actually required was something that turns out to be much, much harder for us humans to manage. It required the humility to simply step back, stop fighting so hard against the natural land, and let an animal that we had once nearly wiped off the face of the earth simply go back to doing what it has always naturally done best. So here is what I really want to leave you with today. For centuries, we treated the humble beaver as nothing more than a pest, a source of fur pelts, and a problem that needed to be trapped and removed. It turns out that this same animal may have actually been one of the single most important natural partners human beings have ever had on this entire planet. And we only figured that important truth out after we had already torn the whole system down and watched huge stretches of the country slowly dry up and die around us. The real question today is no longer whether or not beavers are capable of healing these damaged landscapes, because they have already proven beyond any doubt that they absolutely can. The real question now is simply whether or not we humans are finally wise enough to step back, get out of their way, and let them keep doing it. I would genuinely love to hear what you personally think about all of this, so please drop your thoughts down in the comments below. If this story changed the way you look at these animals, please take a moment to share it with somebody you know who still thinks of a beaver as nothing more than an annoying nuisance. And please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because putting together true stories, this strange and this well-researched, takes a real amount of time and effort. And there are plenty more incredible stories like this one still waiting to be told. I am Edmund Hale, and thank you so much for watching.